What if entertainment meant watching people fight to the death, facing wild beasts, or surviving brutal punishments in front of thousands of cheering spectators? Ancient Rome turned cruelty into spectacle, and some of its games were so horrifying that they still shock the world today. Stay until the end to discover the most brutal game that even Romans feared. In ancient Rome, gladiator battles were among the most famous and brutal forms of entertainment. These deadly contests took place inside massive arenas like the legendary Colosseum, where thousands of spectators gathered to watch men fight for their lives. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals forced into combat, though some free men volunteered for fame and fortune. They trained in special schools where they learned how to use swords, shields, tridents, and nets. Once inside the arena, there was no guarantee of survival. The crowd cheered loudly as fighters clashed, and the emperor or event organizer often decided whether a defeated gladiator would live or die. Some matches were carefully planned displays of skill, while others were pure bloodshed. The goal was simple: entertain the audience at any cost. These battles reflected Roman values of courage, strength, and dominance, but they also revealed a dark obsession with violence. The roar of the crowd, the smell of blood, and the constant threat of death made these games unforgettable. For the Romans, it was thrilling; for their fighters, it was often a death sentence. Gladiators became symbols of bravery and tragedy, remembered as both heroes and victims of a cruel system that turned human suffering into public entertainment. Another shocking Roman spectacle was the damnatio, or wild beast hunt, where humans fought dangerous animals for public amusement. Exotic creatures such as lions, tigers, elephants, bears, leopards, and even crocodiles were brought from distant parts of the empire, including Africa and Asia, to be displayed and killed in the arena. These events amazed Roman crowds because many people had never seen such animals before. Hunters known as bestiarii entered the arena armed with spears and limited protection, facing beasts that were hungry, frightened, and extremely aggressive. Sometimes criminals were thrown into the arena defenseless as punishment, forced to face wild animals with no chance of survival. This was not sport, it was execution disguised as entertainment. The audience watched as blood stained the sand and animals roared in terror or rage. Emperors used these spectacles to show their wealth and power, proving they could control nature itself. Some events involved hundreds of animals slaughtered in a single day. The cruelty was immense, not only toward humans but also toward the animals taken from their homes and forced into violent performances. Nations symbolized Roman domination over both man and beast, but they also exposed the empire's brutal hunger for spectacle. It was a terrifying display of power where survival was rare and mercy almost non-existent. One of the most horrifying punishments in ancient Rome was called damnatio ad bestias, meaning condemnation to beasts. This was not a contest or a fair fight, it was a public execution where condemned prisoners were thrown into the arena to be torn apart by wild animals. Victims were often criminals, slaves, prisoners of war, or early Christians accused of defying Roman authority. They were usually unarmed, chained, or dressed in costumes that mocked myths and legends, making their deaths even more humiliating. Lions, bears, leopards, and bulls were commonly used, and the executions were staged like dramatic performances for the crowd's amusement. Thousands of spectators watched as people screamed, ran, and fought desperately for survival against impossible odds. There was no escape, only fear and suffering. The Romans believed such punishments displayed justice and the power of the state, but in reality, they were acts of extreme cruelty. Some emperors used these executions to spread fear and control the population. The arena became a place where death was turned into theater, and human life meant very little. For victims, it was the most terrifying end imaginable. For the audience, it was another day of entertainment. Damnatio ad bestias remains one of the darkest examples of how far Roman society would go in the name of public spectacle and political power. One of the most unbelievable spectacles in ancient Rome was the naumachia, or mock naval battle. These events were so massive that entire arenas, lakes, or specially built basins were flooded to recreate real sea battles. Thousands of prisoners, slaves, and condemned men were forced to fight on ships while crowds watched from the shore or from specially constructed seating areas. Unlike gladiator games, naumachia were even more deadly because escape was nearly impossible. Fighters had to battle with swords, arrows, fire, and drowning all at once. Many were chained to ships, ensuring they would die if their vessel sank. Emperors such as Julius Caesar and Emperor Claudius organized these events to impress the public and display imperial power. One famous naval battle under Claudius reportedly involved thousands of men and dozens of ships on a massive artificial lake. The purpose was not military training, it was pure entertainment built on suffering. The audience cheered as ships collided, men screamed for mercy, and bodies disappeared beneath the water. These events showed Rome's obsession with larger and more brutal spectacles. The cost in human life was enormous, but for Roman rulers, the display of power was worth it. Naumachia were among the grandest and cruelest forms of entertainment ever created, proving that in Rome, even war itself could be turned into a public game. Chariot racing was one of the most popular sports in ancient Rome, but behind the excitement was incredible danger and frequent death. These races were held in giant stadiums like the famous Circus Maximus, which could hold over 150,000 spectators. Drivers raced lightweight two-wheeled chariots pulled by teams of horses at terrifying speeds around sharp turns and crowded tracks. Crashes were common and often deadly. When chariots collided, horses panicked, wheels shattered, and drivers were dragged across the ground, sometimes torn apart before the crowd's eyes. Many drivers wrapped the reins around their waists for better control, but this also meant they could be pulled to death if they crashed. Despite the risks, successful charioteers became celebrities, admired like modern sports stars. Some earned huge fortunes and loyal fan followings. Rival teams, marked by colors like red, blue, green, and white, created fierce competition among spectators, sometimes leading to riots in the city. The excitement of speed mixed with the possibility of sudden death made the races thrilling and brutal. Unlike gladiators, many chariot racers chose this life willingly, hoping for fame and wealth, but the arena offered no mercy. Every race could be their last. The roar of the crowd, the pounding of hooves, and their violent crashes made chariot racing one of Rome's most dangerous and unforgettable spectacles. In ancient Rome, executions were not hidden from society, they were public performances designed to entertain and intimidate. Criminals, rebels, slaves, and political enemies were often killed in front of large crowds in arenas or public squares. These deaths were carefully staged to maximize fear and drama. Some prisoners were burned alive, crucified, beheaded, or forced into deadly reenactments of famous myths where the ending was real death. For example, a condemned person might be dressed as a mythological character and killed in a way that matched the story. These executions often took place during breaks between gladiator fights, making death just another part of the day's entertainment. Emperors used them to show strength and warn citizens what happened to those who challenged Roman law. The crowd watched not only for justice but for excitement. The suffering of the condemned became a lesson and a spectacle at the same time. Even children could witness these brutal punishments, showing how deeply normalized violence had become in Roman culture. Mercy was rare, and humiliation was often part of the punishment. Victims were mocked, tortured, and displayed before death. This public cruelty strengthened fear of authority and reminded everyone of the empire's absolute control. In Rome, punishment was not private, it was theater, and the audience expected blood. One of the cruelest punishments in ancient Rome was execution by fire. People accused of serious crimes such as treason, arson, rebellion, or religious defiance could be sentenced to be burned alive in front of a crowd. This was not only meant to kill but also to create fear in everyone watching. Victims were often tied to wooden stakes in public squares or inside arenas while people gathered to witness the flames rise. Sometimes these executions were linked to festivals or major public events, turning suffering into spectacle. Early Christians were among those who famously faced such brutal deaths during periods of persecution, especially under rulers like Emperor Nero. Historical accounts describe how some were covered in flammable substances and used as human torches to light imperial gardens at night. The cruelty was meant to send a message: challenge Roman authority, and your death would be unforgettable. The crowd watched as screams filled the air and smoke covered the sky. For many Romans, this was seen as justice, but for others, it revealed the terrifying extremes of imperial power. Fire represented total destruction, making it one of the most feared forms of execution. It was slow, painful, and impossible to escape. These public burnings remain one of the darkest examples of Roman punishment, where death was not enough, the suffering had to be visible, memorable, and terrifying for all. Crucifixion was one of the most painful and humiliating punishments used in ancient Rome. It was mainly reserved for slaves, rebels, pirates, and those considered enemies of the state. Roman citizens were usually spared this fate because it was seen as too shameful. Victims were forced to carry part of their wooden cross through public streets while crowds watched and mocked them. Once at the execution site, they were nailed or tied to the cross and left hanging for hours or even days until death finally came. The suffering was extreme. Pain, thirst, exposure, and slow suffocation made crucifixion one of the most feared punishments in the empire. The goal was not just death but humiliation and public warning. Crosses were often placed along roads so everyone passing by could see what happened to those who disobeyed Rome. One of the most famous historical examples connected to crucifixion is the death of Jesus of Nazareth under Roman rule. But thousands of others suffered the same fate, often without names remembered by history. After slave rebellions like that of Spartacus, entire roads were lined with crucified prisoners as a warning to others. It was a brutal display of state power and control. In Rome, crucifixion was not simply punishment, it was psychological warfare, designed to spread fear far beyond the victim. Many people imagine Roman arenas only filled with gladiator battles, but some of the most horrifying events happened during the midday break. While the morning was often for animal hunts and the afternoon for gladiator combat, noon was reserved for public executions. This time became known for some of the cruelest punishments in Roman entertainment. Prisoners were brought into the arena with no armor, no weapons, and no chance of survival. Some were forced to fight each other to the death. Others were killed by animals, fire, or staged mythological punishments. The crowd often treated these moments casually, eating food and talking while people died before them. The executions were considered less prestigious than gladiator contests, but they were often more brutal because there was no skill, only suffering. Writers from the time described how prisoners were used like props in violent performances. A person might be dressed as a legendary figure and killed in a way that matched the myth, making death part of the show. These midday killings reveal how normalized cruelty had become in Roman society. Death was scheduled between entertainment events like an ordinary performance. For the condemned, noon meant terror. For the audience, it was simply part of the ticket. This horrifying routine showed that in Rome, human life could be treated as little more than background entertainment. The most shocking truth about ancient Rome is that the brutality was not limited to one game, it was the entire system of entertainment itself. Whether it was gladiators fighting to the death, prisoners being torn apart by beasts, men drowning in mock naval wars, or victims burning alive before cheering crowds, the real game was power. Roman rulers understood that fear and entertainment could work together. By turning death into spectacle, they kept the people distracted, impressed, and obedient. The arenas became symbols of control, where emperors displayed wealth, authority, and dominance over both humans and nature. Crowds demanded bigger shows, more blood, and more excitement, pushing the limits of cruelty further. What shocks modern audiences most is not just the violence, but how normal it was for Roman society. Families attended these events together. Children watched executions. Heroes were made from survivors of slaughter. The empire celebrated pain as performance. Yet these brutal games also reveal something important about history: civilization and cruelty can exist side by side. Rome gave the world roads, laws, and architecture, but it also built systems where suffering became entertainment. The cheers inside places like the Colosseum remind us that history is not only about glory, it is also about darkness. And perhaps the most brutal game of all was convincing an entire society that watching death was normal.